viewers, and welcome back. In this video I'm going to be talking about airbrushes. This is something that I've just recently kind of started getting a little bit better at. I've only been doing it for a couple months, so I'm by no means an expert, so please don't expect to see any miraculous techniques or anything super cool looking, kind of like the green stuff tutorial when I warned you beforehand. I'm not a master sculptor, and I'm definitely by no means a master airbrusher. I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of information, maybe if you were curious about it or kind of hesitant about jumping into it, kind of like I was. I just had to kind of go for it. Like most things, I kind of go overboard sometimes. So I'll just kind of give you a little bit of information on basically what I know. I'll show you my setup and show you maybe a little bit of what I use it for, how I use it, and then as I get a little bit better at it, perhaps I'll start making some more videos and show you some of the things I've done and how to do them. Now, before I start, I need to mention that airbrushing is pretty expensive. Once you calculate in the cost of all the airbrushes and the compressor and the pump and all the parts that you need to stick everything together, and perhaps using some different paints if you use the pre-made airbrush paints, it definitely gets a little bit pricey. So if you're wanting a cheap alternative to painting, this is absolutely not it. But if you have a little bit of money to throw around and you want to try your hand at it, definitely worth a shot. So there's a couple different airbrushes you can see in front of you here. They are all made by Badger. This first one right here is one of the first ones that I bought. It's just a little cheapo one. And there's two different kinds of airbrushes. There's a single stage and a dual stage airbrush. This one here is a single stage. It's also a siphon feed, which the difference between a siphon feed and this one over here, these two are considered gravity feed airbrushes, is the way that the paint actually goes into the brush and transfers over onto your models. So we'll talk about this one first. This again is my first airbrush that I bought. It's a little cheapo Badger. I don't even remember the number on it. It's not printed on here. It just came in a little kit. Nothing fancy to it whatsoever. And again, this being a single stage airbrush, all you do is you push this little button on top once you've hooked your hose up to your compressor, and it sprays some air out with your paint. Now the paint in this comes in this, you put it in this jar, screw your lid on, and then this little hose here attaches up into that space there. So you kind of wiggle that in there, and again it's considered a siphon feed because the paint's at the bottom, and as the air is traveling through the brush here, it's basically pulling the paint up. So it's going to require you to have a little bit higher PSI setting on your airbrush. But you can hold a lot of paint. I typically use this now only for base coating. It provides a really smooth, nice, even coat. You may not always get that when it comes to doing it by hand, depending on the consistency of your paint. If maybe you mixed it a little differently, you might get some brush strokes or you may miss some areas. This is really good for getting a coverage on it. It's also really useful for large models. So if you're painting big monstrous creatures or tanks, it takes a heck of a lot less time to do it this way than it does by hand. So that's all I use this for. That you don't really get any kind of precision control out of it. I mean, you can dial this little piece down just a little bit, but all that's going to do is instead of it spraying paint everywhere, it might tighten up, this much versus this much, and that's about the only difference you're going to get. You're definitely not going to be painting any special details or flames or skulls or anything cool like that on your models. So again, this I just use only for base coating, and at the end of the video I'm just going to show you how well it works on some of the models that I've got. So again, these two here, these are considered gravity feed, and obviously gravity pulls objects down, so the little bowl for the paint is on the top of the airbrush as you're using it, and it just kind of flows down in there. You can kind of see right there, that's the needle. So the paint sits basically on top of that, and the reason this is a dual stage airbrush is it works in two ways. So this little lever that's on top here, it pushes straight down, starts spraying air. So even if my paint cup's full of air and I'm pointing it at my model, if I push down on this, only air is going to come out. There won't be any paint. Unless obviously there's some residual paint in there from the last model I sprayed. Maybe I didn't clean it as well, and some of it may spray out, but for the most part it should be just air. And then, so you push that to start the airflow, and some of them, like this one here, sorry, I didn't mention this one. This is a Badger Patriot 105. And then this is the Renegade series. This is the Velocity. It still has all the little fancy caps on it. I haven't even used this one yet. I just received it in the mail not long ago. But as you push this down, it just again starts the airflow, and then you pull it back, and you can see there's like a little kind of track in there. And as you pull it back, it pulls that needle. So you can even see the needle moving inside the cup there, how it pulls it back, and right at the tip there. See the needle, how it kind of disappears back inside once you pull it. So the needle obviously has a little bit of a point to it, so it's coming out of that hole. and as you pull it back, it makes more of a gap for the paint to flow around that needle. So the farther you pull it back, the wider your spray pattern is going to be. And then so if you can push it down and get just a little bit of airflow going and pull it back only a little bit, you can do a lot more fine detail work. And if you want to go ahead and use this to base coat, you can just let it rip and pull back and go ahead and start spraying your model. This one right here is a little bit more expensive option than this Patriot 105. And again, this one's designed to do a lot more finer detail. It's advertises that you can spray from a hairline. So basically you're supposed to be able to paint like this yellow line that's on the mat here, about that thin, all the way up to 2 inches, depending on how far you pull back on this needle and how much air you have flowing through it. And again, that kind of goes back to, I said you needed a little bit more airflow for one of these because you're using the air to siphon the paint out of the cup. For this one, usually you want to read the instruction manual and it'll tell you specifically what PSI that you're going to want to use this airbrush with, because you're not going to be able to do fine detail if you have the air cranked all the way up. You're just going to be splattering paint everywhere and getting frustrated and making a mess, and it does get very frustrating. One of the benefits to this type of airbrush for the siphon feed also is swapping between paint colors, or cleaning your airbrush is made a lot easier because all the paint's contained in this jar. So if you have a just a stash of these little jars laying around, just fill these jars with your favorite paint color. You can undo the ends here. You're only going to end up with a little bit of paint on the inside of this. You can usually get a little brush or something and kind of clean it out. Maybe spray some cleaner through it and it'll be perfectly fine because there's anything really inside of here. The problem with the gravity feed is that this paint cup, as you can see, obviously there's some paint left over. You got to have some airbrush cleaner. There's a bunch of different brands of the airbrush cleaner you can get. So when I kind of put my paint in there, however much I'm going to use, I spray my model. I want to use another color because I'm doing a highlighting or shading or some kind of other crazy technique that I'm working on, and now I need to go to the next shade in that color. It helps if you want to add that color to the next one. So let's say I'm going from a light blue and then I add a couple drops of dark blue just to get that transition. Well, then I'm going to need the dark blue by itself next. I'm still going to have to get rid of all that paint that's in here. So basically you'll spray off whatever you have extra. Eventually you'll get the hang of how much you need in there and hopefully get close so you're not just wasting paint. And then once all that paint's gone from there, you're going to want to pour some of the cleaner in here, kind of spray it out, maybe kind of fill it halfway, clean it out, maybe run a brush through there, knock some of it loose, because you don't want to go to the next color and still have a little bit of residual in there and you start spraying and now all of a sudden your colors are messed up and you're going to have to start all over. Again, this technique takes a little bit to get down for airbrushing. Definitely not something you're going to just sit down and master it right away, unless maybe there's that 1% of people out there that can. I'm not in that 1%, so it's taken me some time just playing with some pieces of sprue or just spraying the little bottom of my station where I spray my stuff. So speaking of stations and where you should be spraying, anytime you're airbrushing, it's just like you're using a can of spray paint. It's the same thing. Tiny little paint particles blown out into the air, definitely stuff you don't want to breathe. It's not meant to go into your lungs, so you definitely want to have some kind of protective gear and work in a well-ventilated area. I was trying to airbrush outside, but here the weather is very finicky, so I've made a little spray booth station thing that I can use in my house, and it's also portable. So I'll get to that in just a second and show you what it looks like and kind of how I've set mine up. Maybe not the best option in the world, but it was pretty cheap and I did it myself in a couple of hours. So you remember the respirators I talked about in the Finecast video, so they're basically going to be the same two options. Definitely if you're going to be airbrushing, highly recommended that you use the type of respirator that has these cartridges on it. It's going to provide a lot more protection from breathing in that those paint particles, because again they do get made pretty small to be aerosolized like that, so you can spray it on your models. So I definitely highly recommend something like this. At a minimum, I would say one of these would be okay. If you can start smelling the paint that you're using through this thing, I would probably advise using something a little bit differently, just because if you're smelling it and breathing it in, it's obviously penetrating the material here and it's not providing the ventilation that it should, or the protection that it should from the particles. So again, you're going to want to work definitely in a well-ventilated area. If you have a garage or something, open the door, open some windows, put on an exhaust fan, put a fan blowing it away from you, something so that you're not sucking all that stuff in your lungs, because you're probably not going to be airbrushing for long if you keep at it. So let me go ahead and I'm going to take the camera down and I'm going to go show you my little workstation and then the spray booth I built, and then I'll base coat a model for you just so you can see what I'm up to with these airbrushes. Alright, so this is my actual airbrush that I use. It's the TC910 Aspire Pro. Again, also made by Badger. I'm not necessarily particular to them, but it's the only brand that I can find at Michael's here, which is the local craft store, and it's a little bit cheaper to say, buying it from them. So as you can see, this is the whole unit. It is pretty hefty. It does come with a 1-gallon storage tank. I would definitely recommend a storage tank if you're planning on airbrushing anything, simply because the way it works is your compressor is the one taking the air and pressurizing it, sending it through your little airbrush hose, which this is the braided hose that goes to my airbrush. And as it's running, it has to keep pumping air, which means it heats up. So the longer that it has to run, the more it heats up, the quicker it's going to burn out. So having a storage tank means it's going to fill that tank. You're going to set your PSI for whatever it is that you're spraying, or whatever level you're spraying at, and it's going to suck air out of that tank. So the longer that it takes air from that tank, that's less time that the compressor is running. Obviously, once it gets low enough, it's going to kick on again, fill up the tank, and then it'll stop, and then you'll be running off the air from the tank. So you definitely, the bigger the storage tank, the better, just again so it doesn't burn up quite as fast. This one came with it's a little pressure regulator, but it only goes so high and so low. And some of the new airbrush that I showed you needs it to go a little bit lower than it was. Otherwise, it basically wouldn't get the desired results. Again, too much air is going to be spitting paint everywhere. It does have a moisture trap here, which is nice. That came with the airbrush. Over time, the air obviously has water in it. It's going to get trapped in this thing. You just kind of push this little button up, and it'll kind of release the water out of it. This here is a pressure regulator that I bought from Lowe's that lets me go a little bit lower and higher on the air pressure that I want. More so on the low side, because I want to again get that fine detail with the airbrush. It's kind of difficult to do. So I just have the adjustment here, so it has its own pressure gauge, again coupled with the one that's on that. So I'll just crank this one up to max. I leave it there, I don't even touch it. And then this bud knob down here is the one that I adjust. So again, the airbrush hose goes all the way up, and this is my little spray booth that I built. This spray booth was made out of a little plastic kind of storage tub container. You can see it has the holes on the side. This is the one that I've used. If you look at it upside down, you should be able to see it. It's just a standard Rubbermaid. I think it's a Brute. Yeah, it's right there. Nothing specifically fancy to it. All I did was take a standard bathroom exhaust fan, or a fart fan as some people call it, mounted it into the back of the box. I had cut a hole through it, used some of this silver tape to seal it up. I made a switch. Obviously this is my power cord, and I have a little bit of a vent hose. It's like kind of you'd use for a dryer. Runs out the back here, and because I'm doing this in the house, again, I don't have to worry about the weather now. So I've got this little piece of wood that I stick in my window, and I just put a hole in it and one of those little vents that blows outside, so now all the paint gets sucked out and goes out the back. In here I have a standard little AC filter. I just had to find one that was the right size. This one happens to be 12 by 20 by 1 inch. You can see there's paint all over this thing. And there's my exhaust fan through the back. Again, I just tried to seal it up as best as I could. There's my little light that I put in here. And again, it just kind of filters through that, sucks it out the back, and then it's not blowing back in my face. You can see all the little spots on my desk here. Another good thing I'd recommend having if you're going to do any airbrushing is a little media jar. This right here is the airbrush holder. Kind of put the nozzle inside of that. This little stand here just helps keep it from tipping over. And when you, again, pour the cleaner on top of those gravity feed airbrushes, you can put it in here and you want to spray it out. Obviously, you don't want to just spray it into the air, because that stuff, again, you don't want to breathe in, and you don't have anywhere good to spray it. You just spray it in this jar. It collects everything in there. You can see all the paint that's dried in the bottom after sitting there for a while. And it has a filter here that keeps it from basically getting out and being harmful to breathe. Okay, so before I get to spraying, I just wanted to show you guys just some different options as far as paints go. My Tyranids, the brown color that I use is that Folk Art Teddy Bear Tan. I mix my own paints for the most part, especially with that, since I want to be consistent with the color. I just had to adapt it to be able to spray it out of an airbrush. And typically to do that with all the craft paints that I have, all I do is I take the paint itself, and depending on the consistency, you kind of start each paint at a 50-50 mix from the paint itself and Windex. Now, depending on the consistency of the paint, and you'll have to learn this over time with the ones that you use and which colors tend to be thicker than others. Again, typically yellow seems to be the thickest that I've encountered. And some of the greens are on the lower end of the scale as far as being a lot thinner, so you have to judge it. And typically for this tan color, because of the consistency it is on its own, I typically do a 60% paint for 40% Windex. And that ends up working out perfectly. And then I'll make it in these bottles just so that I have a batch that's typically consistent. Usually you can kind of just measure between the top and the bottom of the bottle here. and find your halfway point and then just adjust up or down, again, depending on how thick the paint is. Obviously, the thicker it is, you want to use more Windex, and the thinner that it is, you want to use less, because if it becomes too watery, then basically you're just spitting Windex all over your model with a little bit of color, and it's going to take you a lot of coats to get anywhere with it. So that's what I use for those. Now, you can purchase other paints that already come specifically designed for airbrush. This is the only one that I can find here. I know there's Vallejo Model Air that a lot of people use and like. I haven't been able to get my hands on it. There's Grex paints. There's all kinds of other ones that are designed specifically for airbrushes. And they'll even tell you, too, on some of the bottles, depending on the size of the airbrush you're using and the size of your needle, you may need to thin them down a little bit, even more than they already are in the bottle. This particular brand, Createx, I didn't even realize this until after I'd sprayed the first couple models and test pieces with it, but it actually tells you to cure it with heat. So typically to do that, usually all I'll do is take my wife's hair dryer, just kind of blow it on the model for a little while until it gets nice and warm, and usually that helps it settle a little bit. So there's just some options. Again, all I'm going to be using is this folk art color that I've mixed with Windex and the brown for you in just a second. One of the things I did want to show you too, again, just so that I did not leave you with anything good that are some product of my work that I've been doing. This is just one of the bone sabers from my Swarmlord model that, again, you can see this is one of the lighter color before the white that's on there. I had to mix up kind of a series of colors from darkest to lightest, and I've kind of airbrushed this bone saber here, just again like a little blending technique. So it's similar to doing the wet blending, but I think the airbrush makes it have a lot better technique, just because of the way that it actually puts the paint down. It's a nice thin layer, and it gets that little extra overspray right at the end where it goes into the next color before starting the next one. It's a really easy and quick technique that you can do that makes it look really cool. I've been trying to work on my non-metallic metal technique. I haven't quite perfected it just because these swords are kind of curved, so it makes it hard to tape it, and it doesn't come out quite right, and I get really aggravated with it pretty quickly, so I haven't quite mastered that yet, but I'm working on it, and perhaps I'll make a video of it once I get the technique down for you. But as you can see, it makes a nice little transition there from darkest to lightest, and it can be used for quite a few techniques. Again, not the only thing you can use it for, but just something that I've kind of gotten my technique down for a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and fill up my siphon feed airbrush with this teddy bear tan, and I'm going to paint up a model for you that I've just got. Now, keep in mind the exhaust fan may or may not be too loud for the camera. I'll have to figure that out once this video is done, when I'm listening to it. So if there is no sound, I'll maybe find some music I can play for you to listen to, and that'll be the reason for it. And if there's anything important going on, I'll just put in some subtitles so you can tell, and then we'll just look at it at the end so you can see the final product. So the Ravener that I just airbrushed has dried. As you can see, it's a nice even base coat over the whole model. I had to go back and just touch up a couple areas that I had missed, but it's usually pretty easy to get into, like some of the areas up under the little headpiece there up in the neck, or getting down in those little two holes there between the back and his head. Airbrush makes it really easy to just throw the paint down in there. Now, I don't know if you could tell or not by looking at it, but when I showed you the wet model right after I had just sprayed it, things like the eye sockets and some of the little pieces of his ribs, or whatever you want to call those there, looked like they were kind of gummed up with wet paint. As you can see, it's all dried nice and even. All that stuff disappeared, and that's one of the other benefits about the about airbrushing with the paint, especially using Windex, is just like using plain Windex on your windows, it dries up really quick and just disappears. It basically does the same thing here. So even if you have a little bit of paint pooled up again, like I did in the eyes and the mouth, once the paint dries and that Windex kind of evaporates and it leaves just the paint, it just leaves behind a nice thin layer and it doesn't kind of clump up. So if I were to do that with paint by hand with a brush and I had left it globbed in there, I'd just have nothing but a glob of paint, and I wouldn't have the luxury of it disappearing for me. So again, comes out nice and even. I really like it. I'm definitely doing all my models this same fashion now. When I get to painting those capillary towers that I showed you I got in the mail a while back, definitely going to make that technique a lot easier, because there's a lot of nooks and crannies in there that the airbrush will be able to reach that a brush would take me weeks to be able to make sure I covered the whole thing. So I hope you guys found this video useful. Please stay tuned for more videos, and thank you for your patience in between me making them. I know there's quite a time delay, and I apologize for that, but unfortunately I'm trying to make these videos in between everything else going on, so I'm trying to get them made for you as quick as I can. I appreciate all the support, the feedback, constructive criticism, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks again.